Welcome. I'm really glad to be here with you. Let's go ahead and get started. My name is Elise Schuster. I'm the co-founder of OKSO, and today we're going to be talking about what consent is and how to talk with young people about consent. Here is our agenda today. We'll go over what consent is, cover gray areas that we might encounter, talk about young people and consent, how the media portrays it, how to talk about it with young people, a special acronym you can remember, and how to respond when we see something. So to kick us off today, let's do some reflecting as we like to do here at OKSO. So grab your worksheet and think about, what if someone asked you what consent was? What goes through your mind? How do you define consent? Take a moment and write down your thoughts. Of course, you can always pause at any time when you're working on the worksheet in any training. So here's how we would define consent. And you can compare this to what you wrote down and notice any differences. Consent is freely given, clear, affirmative, specific, and it's a decision between people to engage in a mutually agreed upon activity. Consent is often and importantly talked about regarding sexual activity. However, consent is always happening. And this is something that we will revisit later. Essentially, consent is one person giving permission to another person about a specific activity. Now that we've gone over what consent is, let's talk about its importance in the world, particularly to young people. Why do you think that it's important for young people to understand consent? Take a moment and write down any reasons why you feel like it's important. So you've probably written down several different things, and that makes sense. One of the reasons that it's really, really important for young people to talk about consent and understand it is that it's a skill that can be used to prevent sexual violence. So if you look at your worksheet, you'll see this diagram, and depending on which direction you go, you will see current statistics regarding sexual violence. As you can see, sexual violence affects people of all backgrounds. Is there anything that surprised you about these statistics? Anything that you didn't expect or you thought was different? Take just a moment and jot down any thoughts that you have. So often when we're talking about consent, we think about really kind of very clear examples. Maybe someone says no loudly and clearly, and the other person doesn't respect it. But in the real world, often consent is much more of a gray area. And it is in these gray areas that young people and all of us struggle the most. So when we're talking about sexuality, these gray areas may not legally be sexual assault, but they are things like coercion or someone feeling forced either physically or emotionally to go along with the activity, even if they didn't really want to. And so these gray areas can include things like someone repeatedly asking, even though the other person has said no. And asking repeatedly is really sort of one person trying to wear the other person down. And so eventually the person who has already said no might say yes, just so that the asking stops. And this is not freely given consent. Something that many of us might have encountered in non-sexual situations is when someone moves into our personal space suddenly and without asking. So whether it's in a sexual situation or not, often people are sort of not sure what to do when this happens, and it can feel scary. Another common gray area is when someone has said yes to one activity, and then the other person increases or adds new activities without asking. So often young people are sort of unsure what to do here because we have this narrative in our culture that if you've already said yes to something, that implies that you're saying yes to everything. But this narrative is false. Sometimes people go along with an activity when they really did not want to. So we're going to go over a scenario depicting a gray area. And as I read it over, I want you on your worksheet to take a moment to write down sort of the concerns that you notice here. Here's the scenario. Renee and Sam are friends who begin dancing and kissing at a party. They both have been drinking but are not drunk. They both agree to go back to Sam's place. Renee begins to intensify the level of contact, undressing and touching Sam. Sam responds by pulling away, moving Renee's hand and saying, "Oh, can we slow down? I'm not sure." Renee stops a moment, but starts to kiss Sam again. Sam does not say anything and does not move. So take a second and write down anything that you noticed that's concerning in this scenario. So you've probably noticed that there are actually a few places in the scenario where consent was given and where consent was not given. So when they were dancing and kissing at the party, consent was given to kissing and dancing. They both also consented to going back to Sam's place. When Renee started intensifying the contact, that's where Renee should have stopped and asked Sam if this was okay, if undressing and touching were okay. And sometimes young people really are sort of not sure what to do or to say in these moments. Sam is trying to give signals to Renee that Sam is not okay with what's happening, pulling away, moving Renee's hand, asking to slow down, saying that they're unsure. And Renee sort of seems to hear Sam when they stop, but then continues on. So in this scenario, Renee is really kind of disregarding and disrespecting Sam's person and breaking Sam's consent. And then the scenario ends with Sam not really saying anything. They don't move. And this can be actually a really common response. Sometimes people shut down or freeze in these kinds of situations. So it's very possible that you are working with a young person or young people who is sharing the kinds of things that we were just talking about with you, but it's more likely that you'll see some of these kinds of situations. They're less intense, but they are absolutely opportunities to jump in and talk with young people about consent. What's really, I think, great about consent conversations is that they can come up in so many situations. So it really gives you the opportunity to help young people understand without having to get into the kind of intimate details of their lives. So here are some of the things that you might see that are opportunities to have conversations about consent. So the first is that sometimes folks believe that it's okay to go through their friends or partners or family members' phone. Maybe this person gave that person permission to use their phone to make a call or send a text, and that's definitely okay. But that doesn't mean that the person is allowed to do anything else with the phone. We really frequently get questions on OKSO where a young person is trying to justify going through someone else's phone because they suspect cheating or because they were given permission to use someone's computer or phone for one thing, and then they went looking around for other things. So our phones and our computers, they're super personal to us, and going through someone else's phone or computer without asking them is an invasion of privacy and a violation of trust, and ultimately it's non-consensual. Another thing that we see is really trying to make another person like them. So you might hear a young person talking about sort of how to get someone to like them. And take a moment and think back to an unrequited love that you once had. Of course, we wish we could change that person's mind, but making another person like us is not possible. So what we see is that sometimes this can change from something that's essentially wishful thinking to actual manipulation. Buying gifts for that person that they don't want or didn't ask for, excessively paying them compliments, which is something known as love bombing, or violating that person's privacy to learn more about what they might like. So it's really someone who's sort of not actually interested in that other person's experience or feelings, but has sort of convinced themselves that they're going to be able to change that person's mind through what they maybe don't see it as manipulation, but it is. Another thing that we commonly see is pressuring someone into doing something and convincing them to do something that they have already said no to. So it might be something like, oh, come on, you never come with us, or you know you're going to have fun, just give it a try, even after that person has said no. So we repeatedly ask, we put pressure on someone, we're trying to kind of wear that person down or play on their feelings of guilt. And this is something that happens like all the time outside of romantic relationships. We see it constantly. It's the person who doesn't want to go drinking with their friends or doesn't want to skip class. It's a super, super common behavior. And we often let it happen because it doesn't seem that harmful. But what we create when we do that is a culture where this kind of pressure is okay. It's sort of expected. It's all right for us to do it because we see people doing it everywhere. And my guess is if you think back, there are times when you have seen a young person not respecting another young person's boundary or pressuring them. And it might seem really small, but it is a beautiful moment to intervene. Someone manipulating another person into doing something is essentially forcing them to do what is being requested, but sort of in a less obvious way. So this can include things like guilt tripping that person, threatening them if they say no, punishing them if they say no, making them feel obligated to follow along. In all those situations, they're not freely consenting and they don't necessarily want to do it, but they're doing it anyway.